Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of Hangouts with Fly Club. I'm Scott Hill, and I'm here with Stephen Netherton. Stephen, make some noise.
Hello, I'm here. I'm hanging out.
That's all we can ask. We are here tonight on a nice, hot July evening in Wichita, Kansas, to talk about one of the most anticipated releases, I would think, of spring of 2018, but also release that's been met with maybe some of the most mixed reviews. Stephen, why don't you tell everybody what it is we're here to talk about tonight?
Yeah, go ahead and show it since you got the actual specimen there. This is
I gotta make noise. The camera's on me there.
Okay. This is the Old Fitzgerald bottled in bond 11-year. So this is a wheated bourbon from Heaven Hill. The Old Fitzgerald line has been out for a long, long time. But this year was the first time that Heaven Hill released an Old Fitzgerald bottled in bond 11-year-old in that fancy decanter, and it's going to become an annual release. Next year's has already been announced as a 9-year-old. But this is the first one, and they really went all out with the packaging and to put together an 11-year-old wheated bourbon product. And I said bottled in bond, so 100 proof. People were really anticipating great things. So we wanted to see what it was like compared to another similarly aged Heaven Hill product. And so, Scott, you can go ahead and make some noise to show what we're comparing it to.
Yeah, I've got both the wonderful faux wood box and the bottle here of the Rebel Yell single barrel 10-year single barrel from Rebel Yell, which is a Heaven Hill wheated bourbon produced by Lusco, but everyone knows it to be Heaven Hill. So these are two very close releases in terms of age. One thing let me point out before we get beyond this, on the Old Fitzgerald bottle, like most old bottled in bonds, because that's what this is trying to replicate, it did say that this was barreled in the spring of 2006 and bottled in the spring of 2018. So it's getting real close to a 12-year-old, so probably just a hair under a 12-year-old.
Yeah, and the sample of Heaven Hill that we're going to be trying was aged since September of 2006, and then bottled in 2016, and then put out on the market. It was the follow-up to the 2015 release from Rebel Yell, this 10-year-old single barrel release. It's not bottled in bond, but it is also 100 proof. That first Rebel Yell single barrel 10-year release in 2015 was met with a very warm reception. People really, really liked it. They were surprised how much they liked it because Heaven Hill previously hadn't really put out anything that was terribly noteworthy. And so since then, there's been more variation than that initial release in 2015. This one's good in its own right. This is not actually the first time that we've compared a Rebel Yell product with an Old Fitzgerald product.
Yeah, well, and let me add one thing here about both of these products here in Wichita. Old Fitzgerald's not been available in Wichita for a number of years. You and I have both fairly recently picked up an old dusty bottle off a shelf, but it's probably been a solid 10 years or so. I don't know the exact date, 10 years or so since Old Fitzgerald was brought to Kansas. So this is the first release that has come back to Kansas, so it's highly anticipated for us for that reason. Same with Rebel Yell. The first couple batches of that or releases of Rebel Yell were not available here in Wichita, but maybe the latest release is something that's become available. So both of these were anticipated nationally, Fitzgerald especially, but certainly welcomed here in Wichita.
Yeah, I don't know whether we were able to get here in Wichita that 2015 release of the Rebel Yell single barrel, but it was pretty soon thereafter that it became available for us. And then, yeah, like you said, Old Fitzgerald, it apparently used to be here, and I found a bottle in small town southeast of Wichita that was just sitting on the shelf for years and years and years, and we think it was released in the early 2000s. And originally we decided, hey, let's compare that to this Rebel Yell product since they share a similar ancestry back to Heaven Hill, and they're both wheated bourbons from Heaven Hill. But my goodness, the Old Fitzgerald Bottled and Bond that we tried that was from that early 2000s was just very, very different than the Rebel Yell single barrel 10-year. Even though the Rebel Yell had, we think, many more years of age on it than that Old Fitz Bottled and Bond, there's just something about bourbons that were aged and bottled years and years ago that have a characteristic that the present day ones don't, even if they've spent a lot of time in the barrel. But now with this Old Fitzgerald release, that it's obviously newer, and it should, you would think, share a lot more similar qualities with this Rebel Yell 10-year. We thought, well, let's do another comparison and see really how they stack up.
I'll add one more thing before we get to tasting it. If you followed Old Fitzgerald in the last few years, you've noticed that its availability nationwide has become very, very limited. The Bottled and Bond, I've got one of the regular Bottled and Bond non-11-year. I've got a handle of that right here. This is delicious, but it's become very, very hard to get. They have the Old Fitzgerald Prime, which it's really is truly a 4-year young, not the best. It's become harder to find. A lot of that's been taken out in favor of Larceny, which is Heaven Hill's newest. It's John E. Fitzgerald Larceny, which still follows the Fitzgerald line, but they're kind of recreating it. It seems like a lot of their stock has been reserved for that. You know, this year we've got on our website that the Larceny Barrel Proof is going to come out. So the Fitzgerald stock has been depleted, and so we were pretty surprised. I think everyone was pretty surprised to see the newest release, the Bottled and Bond 11-year come out. So I think with that, let's you want to start with the Old Fitzgerald?
Yeah, I don't think it makes too much of a difference. Are you just going to go back and forth? You're going to finish one and then finish the other?
Let's kind of go back and forth a little bit, kind of nose to nose, and we'll go that direction.
Okay. I'll start out with the Fitz.
And I've got my Old Fitzgerald here in a Flight Club Glencairn, so if I start confusing the two, I know which one's which.
Good. That's got some pretty rich milk chocolate right up front.
Yeah, I get milk chocolate. I get honey. Kind of some earthy, maybe kind of leather kind of notes.
It doesn't have, some of the wheated bourbons over at like Buffalo Trace, for example. It seems like they more jump out with like the cherry type of or other fruit scents in the nose, whereas this doesn't have much in the way of fruit right up front.
It doesn't jump out of the glass at all. It's pretty mellow. Honey's a flavor that I typically associate with kind of being mellow. But you're right. There's not a lot of fruit flavors. There's a little bit of maybe some cinnamon spice or some other kind of spice on there that maybe it's just an oak spice, kind of that dry oak spice. But it doesn't jump out of the glass. Yeah,
there might be maybe like some light nutmeg, but this does not nose like something that's 100 proof. Frankly, it's not like there's not a whole lot there. I think there is good depth and character to it, but you don't get an ethanol hit on the nose right up front on this one.
And in isolation, I'm not sure that I would peg this for 11 years from the nose.
That's true. Even though you do get a pretty strong oak influence, and notably, it doesn't have like that kind of green oak to it, where some stuff that's just not in the barrel for very long, you do get oak, but you can tell it's almost like it's some character of the oak where it didn't fully saturate the barrel and didn't really go deep into those pores and get extracted back out over various seasons. This has seemed like did. I think it's an inviting nose is how I would describe it.
Yeah, I'm pleased with it. Would I like maybe a little bit more pop out of the nose? Maybe, but there's nothing about this that bothers me. And we'll talk about it later. That, like I said, the reviews have been pretty mixed on this. There's nothing wrong with this nose, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, this is um, there's not a lot of like the graham cracker influence, but it's kind of like a s'more where you got the marshmallow, the milk chocolate. If you didn't really toast the marshmallow for very long, but like just enough to brown it, you really get that kind of flavor profile in there, which of course is very nice. It's not terribly unique, but it's nice.
All
Yeah.
right.
Solid nose.
Yeah, I grabbed my Rebel Yell, and right away, I talked about the Old Fitz not really popping out of the glass. This has a more robust nose to it, certainly, than the Old Fitz.
Yeah, it does. There's almost a little bit of like a what hit me first was like kind of like a chalkboard. I'm not sure why, but that's what is jumping out at me right now. More char.
Yeah, I definitely get more oak, more char. The oak may come across as a little bit kind of chalky, dusty, and that doesn't surprise me that you would say that.
There is more ethanol in this one, even though they're exact same proof. That comes across. Still not a lot, just more than the Fitz.
I get a little cocoa on this one.
Yeah.
I would say maybe in both of them there's not a lot of underlying fruit flavors. I wouldn't say there are a lot like the cherry kind of fruit flavors, but more of the kind of orchard fruits maybe.
Yeah, this has some grape skin too.
They're pretty close. I mean, they're different from one another, but as far as my enjoyment of the two, they're pretty close.
They are pretty close, actually. Yeah, I think so. And even though we might go along here and comment on how the Rebel Yell stacks up, I think part of the reason why we're doing that is because the Old Fitz retails at twice as much as the Rebel Yell does, basically.
And I think people don't necessarily say it, but I think that's at the heart of people's problem with the Old Fitz is they're a little bit upset that you put a $50 bourbon in a $65 decanter and put it out for $115. And it's not a $65 decanter, so there's some.
Yeah, and it's almost a little bit uncharacteristic for not just Old Fitz the brand, but Heaven Hill, which typically puts out just really affordable products. But hey, they saw the market and they did what they did.
All right, let's go back over anything else you want to comment on the nose, or you want to
a little bit of like with those little tiny boxes of raisins, but like when they're empty, it kind of smells like that little bit of mix of like cardboard with like the raisin type scent, even though it's not terribly fruity. Is what
it's a deeper sugary sweetness that's I associate with fruit. I definitely get that. You want to score these noses as we go?
Yeah, sure, we can. I think if I were to give a score to both of them, they'd be probably within about half a point of each other. So right now I'm thinking the Fitz would be like a 3.5 to me, just because it's inviting and I like that flavor profile I described before. And then the Rebel Yell would be a 3. I'm not dissatisfied by anything about it, but there's also nothing that really makes it move into something that's exceptional.
Yeah, you're right in line with where I would score them as well. As I come back to the Old Fitz after the Rebel Yell, I'm getting a little bit more vanilla with it, just additional complexity, layers of flavor. And you're definitely right that the Rebel Yell has a layer of ethanol burn to it that is absent and is very pleasing in the Old Fitz.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to dive into the Fitz.
My first impression is it's a little thinner than I would like. It has kind of a nutty, thin kind of nutty texture to it. just not quite as thick as I would like to see.
Hmm.
I'm still getting some of those honeys, maybe some brown sugar, leather. There's some more of those spices. You're right, nutmeg from the nose, cinnamon, a little bit of vanilla.
The spice is more prominent on the palate than it was on the nose. It's got a little bit of punch to it on the beginning of the palate, that mellows out gradually throughout the rest of the palate and into the finish. But it's one of those where I think when you're trying to describe like something that has, like you said, it's a little bit thin, but at the same time, it's kind of creamy with the mouthfeel too. It's oily. It's not drying, and so I think that helps those flavors kind of dance around and stay a little bit longer than they otherwise would, which is nice. I like that about it. But yeah, it's not something where like it's got that almost chewy kind of characteristic to it that you're kind of left hoping for. It's just not quite there. What you would think. I mean, it's 11 years old and 100 proof. I don't know what else they needed to do to get that. It just doesn't have it in it. Maybe it's the wheat. Maybe just that's hard to get with the wheat. I don't know.
Well, if you remember, at least my memory of your bottle of Old Fitz Bottled and Bond that you talked about earlier, the dusty bottle you found on the shelf, to me, I remember that being exceptionally chewy. So it surprised me a little bit that I wasn't getting more of that on this. I mentioned orchard fruit earlier. I'm getting a little bit more of that. Grapes and probably some kind of apple kind of flavors in there as well. It kind of, those flavors subtly kind of go and transition into the finish. I'm not picking up a whole lot more on the finish. I would say I get a little almost pepperiness on the finish. It's more oak, leather. The finish isn't exceptionally long, and it's not exceptionally different than the palate.
Yeah, the finish for me kind of starts to develop into like peanut M&Ms, like the brown ones. Like you don't get something else from the candy coating. And so there's that nuttiness that I get much more on the back end of the palate and on the finish. But yeah, I do get like the purple grapes mid palate, I think, which is a good compliment there. I really get the most strong and prominent note I get throughout is still the milk chocolate, which is surprising me a little bit, but it's there the whole way through. So it's not dark chocolate. It's not bitter in any respect. It's got that kind of creamy characteristic to it still.
Yeah, the peanut M&M milk chocolate flavor I think is spot on. And I'm sitting here, 45 seconds or 30 seconds after the last sip that I had, it really lingers in your mouth as though you just kind of chewed up some peanut M&Ms, and that kind of residual flavor is there. It is a milk chocolate. It is a background of some peanuttiness. It's interesting, if nothing else.
It is, and what you said, the comparison to that early 2000s Old Fitz, which was a butterscotch candy bomb. This has no hint of that butterscotch at all, which I can only think is because of the barrels that they used to have from that older stock of oak that must be depleted now. If you were to put this Old Fitz compared to that early 2000s Old Fitz Bottled and Bond, I don't know how you could think that they were from the same distillery, much less the same brand.
Yeah, I don't disagree at all on this. And it remind me, let's come back later, and although we're comparing it here to Rebel Yell, let's compare it to later some of the Buffalo Trace products that are in that 10 to 12 years old, and kind of give your thought on that as well.
Yeah. All right, I'm moving to Rebel here. The Rebel Yell starts out a lot more with the nutty characteristic, whereas the Fitz had on the back end. I think I get more of that kind of nutty peanuts and cashews both on the front end, maybe some almonds too, of the palate on this, but it's still wrapped up in that. There is some chocolate, a little bit of caramel. There's more vanilla on the palate than I got on the nose. The finish, I can already tell on this, is a little bit drier, not as long as the Fitz is. It's still a decent finish though.
This to me is a lot creamier, more mouth coating texture than the Old Fitz. Right off the get go, milk chocolates. I get some of the kind of I'm starting to get a little bit of the cherries in this that I associate sometimes with those older wheated bourbons. You're right. This transitions to a little bit of a drier oak, drier chocolate finish. But the palate on this is really darn good.
It seems to not quite have the depth of the Old Fitz, but at the same time, I'm not picking up on anything in the palate that's off-putting either. Even for somebody that might not regularly enjoy something above like 90 proof, that wouldn't usually venture towards something at 100 proof or greater. I don't think this would be too much outside of their comfort zone.
Yeah, I hear you on the depth of flavor. I just kind of went back and forth a little bit, and you're right there. There are layers of the Old Fitz that are pretty interesting, are pleasing, are absent from the Rebel Yell. But I still keep on the Old Fitz. I keep coming back to I'm not the biggest fan of the texture of it. It's a little bit thinner than I like. Keeping out for the time being, it's a $115 bottle. I'm just straight up. I just think it's a little bit thin, and that thinness to me just kind of shades the whole experience.
So you think the Rebel Yell does not have that thin character that the Fitz does?
I don't think it does. I think the Rebel Yell is a lot more mouth coating. It does dry out a little bit more on the finish, but that at least for me gives some transition, a nice transition from the palate to the finish. It goes from sort of mouth coating, a little bit sweeter notes, still some oak in there, and then dries out a little bit. The Old Fitz it's kind of got those same kind of thin flavors. They're nice flavors. There's some depth to them, but they just kind of level out all the way through the palate, through the finish.
Yeah, the Rebel Yell is kind of like a grape soda, in the sense that you've got that kind of syrupy grape sweetness starting at the mid palate and then going into the finish, but then like that carbonated water then kind of dries everything out towards the end and kind of fizzles out in that direction. I can see where you're coming from with that. I don't know if I would have, and maybe I would need to spend more time with that. I don't know if I would have described the Old Fitz as thin. I don't know, part of it's expectations coming into it, but I see where you're coming from with then in light of the Rebel Yell and that contrast.
It's weird. I just went back to it, and it has some oiliness to it, and maybe it's this level of kind of dry oak that helps characterize that Old Fitzgerald, that to me is coming across as thinness. Someone else may come across as just a layer of kind of dry oak in there. But to me, that's what's bothering me with it. I don't hate it by any means, but that's my criticism of it.
Yeah, and it's a fair criticism, especially, listen, if you're going to put a product out there and you're going to really dress it up, and then you're going to price it at that price point above $100, you're really kind of inviting criticism. You're saying, go ahead, take your hits. We think this will stand up. Why would you put it out otherwise? And so I think it's fair to lodge those. But I think you're right. You do need to come back and say, this is not to say that it's subpar, but it begs for that expectation. And when not met, you note it.
As far as scoring goes on our scale, reminding everyone that, kind of a 1 to 5 scale, it's kind of a true 1 to 5 scale. 3 is right in the middle, is satisfying to us. Anything up below is less than satisfying or unsatisfying, and you go up from there. So 3 is a good score on our scale. I would probably rate the palate and finish both on this Old Fitzgerald as a 3. None of it wows me where I'm more than satisfied. I'm not less than satisfied by it by any means, but it doesn't do a lot for me. I'll drink it. I'm happy with it, but I'm not super excited about it.
Yeah, I think I would give it a 3.5. But yeah, I'm not ready to give a 4, which to us is, exceeds expectations or more than satisfied, however you want to term that. It doesn't quite get to that point, but a little bit of it is just the fact that I like that, peanut M&M combination of sweet, a little bit of savory in there. I like that the finish doesn't dry out. I typically don't like a finish that gets dry or tannic. And so I'd give it a little bit more than a 3, and so I would score it a 3.5 on both. But then going back to the Rebel Yell, I think I'm at a 3.5 on the palate there too. It's a little bit different than the Fitz, but I think I like it about the same. But then I go back down to a 3 on the finish just because of that turn it takes towards drying out. I think the duration of both finishes is actually about the same, or they're so similar you really can't score them differently based on the duration of the finish. But just because it gets a little bit dry, I don't think it gets tannic, but I do think it gets dry. Is where I think it falls back down to a 3 for me.
I'm right there on the Rebel Yell on a 3.5 on the palate. I'm probably right there on a 3 on the finish as well. And rating that a 3, going back and forth again, I'd probably raise my score on the Old Fitz finish to a 3.5. You're right that it's got that really interesting, fun peanut M&M lingering flavor to it that's lacking in the Rebel Yell. Rebel Yell probably for me is just that spot on 3 on satisfying, but I will have to give the leg up to the Old Fitz on the finish.
Yeah. What you mentioned about comparing to some of the Buffalo Trace weeded bourbons, what those I think bring that these don't is a dimension of like that cherry fruitiness, and they are much sweeter than either of these products. Not cloyingly sweet, but in a way that it seems like complements some of those other creamy, chocolatey type flavors in a good way, and in a way that enhances it. Buffalo Trace has really figured something out with its weeded products, obviously. But if we could only get one that was just right at 100 proof, that would be nice.
Yeah, definitely. Buffalo Trace brings a sweetness to it that this lacks. Sometimes I enjoy that. Sometimes I get burnt out on that Buffalo Trace sweetness, especially with their weeded mash bill. But you look at Buffalo Trace, you look at Maker's Mark, also a weeded bourbon that's also on the sweet side. I'm kind of drawing a blank as to the other big players in weeded bourbon. I think we're about that within Heaven Hill and Old Fitz. But Old Fitz definitely takes a different path to it. It is not an overall sweet profile, at least not on any of these products. It's more of the chocolatey, drier nuttiness to it. That Heaven Hill nuttiness does play into this, and is very enjoyable. But if you're coming from this as I love the Weller 12 or the Old Rip Van Winkle 10 sweetness, cherry flavors, this may not live up to those expectations. But if you're looking for something beyond just that sweetness of the Weller products, I think this is pretty darn good.
Yeah, and for those like me and the vast majority of us that were unable to get an Old Fitz 11-year bottled and bond, you can enjoy your Rebel Yell single barrel, hopefully at half the price, and rest assured that you're still having a satisfying experience.
Yeah, it is readily available. One of the comments that I've heard from many people on the Old Fitz is that it reminds them a lot of a Rebel Yell single barrel, but not the really, really good Rebel Yell single barrels. It's just kind of one of the mediocre Rebel Yell single barrels. And that may be kind of right, because you and I have both had some Rebel Yell single barrels, especially the 2015 release that you talked about, that was really, really, really good. And for me, competed up there with Old Rip Van Winkle 10-year as just super solid 10-year wheated bourbon. I don't think this lives up to those sorts of levels or expectations, but it's still pretty darn good.
Yeah.
Overall score, what would you give overall for the Old Fitz?
For the Old Fitz, because I was basically 3.5 all the way down the line, I'll stick with 3.5. Our overall does not take into account value, but it also is not a mathematical computation of just the nose, palate, and finish and average. It's just stepping back and evaluating the overall experience, more big picture. I'm still right there, 3.5, where I'm not quite to exceeds expectations or more than satisfied 4 out of 5 ranking that we give. But I think it's deserving of more than just a satisfied 3 out of 5 score.
Yeah, where I ultimately ended up on 3.5, 3.5, I would lean towards a 3.5 on the overall score. It is good. I am overall happy with it. We'll get to value in a minute, but I'm a little bit more than satisfied with it. I think that's fair. And I'd say the same about the Rebel Yell. I'm probably right at a 3.5 with this single barrel Rebel Yell as well.
Yeah, I don't think I'd argue with that. I think 3.5 is very fair for this Rebel Yell. It's solid. There is that little part of the drying characteristic of the finish that I think detracted just a bit for me, but to bring it down on the score just because of that, I think would be a little bit unfair. And so I feel good about a 3.5, I think.
Yeah, and not to mention the acetone you get on the nose. I don't think the Rebel Yell is quite as refined as this Old Fitz, but overall I think they come to the same conclusion. Yeah. Value, we're at $115 for Old Fitz, and let me throw out there as well, those are basically sold out at $115. And secondary markets where you're looking for a lot of these. And when these first came out, I mean, these were $350 on the secondary market, if not more. That price has continued to go down and down and down, where they're now, the last that I looked, maybe even yesterday or today, going for 185 shipped. The price keeps going down on these. What seems to have happened is there was a lot of excitement on them. People didn't open bottles. The people who did open the bottles said, this isn't that great. And so the demand really started decreasing and the prices coming down.
Yeah, so if we were to score it on the value, let's just do it based on retail first. I think at retail, I would have to give it probably a 2, and that might seem harsh right up front, but when you understand that, look, you're pricing this at the same price point as George T. Stagg. You're putting it in the same price point as, higher even. You're putting it up against, cask strength Scotch. You're putting it against whiskeys that are heavy hitters, and people are going to expect a certain experience from that. And because of that rightful expectation, I'm going to put it as a 2, which on our scale is just less than satisfied.
Yeah, I'm right there. Keep in mind, I got a bottle here in Wichita, and I think I paid about 135 for it. So I had to pay over retail to get one. There were not very many that came to Wichita or Kansas at all, as far as I know. I was pretty happy to be able to find one because it's interesting, it's fun, it's different. But overall, I think you're right on a two. At 135 or above, I'm starting to maybe even flirt with something a little bit lower than that. You think about, go back to Weller. Weller 12 retail price is $35. You look at old Rip Van Winkle, and I think its retail is 79 maybe. You talk about William LaRue Weller and the BTAC, retail on that maybe 99. I know those are hard to find, but frankly, so is this. Those blow this away.
Yeah, and when you said, it being interesting and different, it would be more interesting and different if there wasn't something like Rebel Yell single barrel 10-year that's also Heaven Hill's wheated bourbon, and it's more readily available and it's half the price. If this was something where you couldn't get a wheated bourbon product from Heaven Hill at 100 proof at over 10 years old, we might think of it a little bit differently because of that nuance and that novelty. It doesn't have that. There are products put out by that same producer that are so similar, not just in specification but experience, that you can't help but be a little bit underwhelmed then by the price of it. So yeah, it looks better on your shelf because they did a great job on the decanter, but that really only goes so far. And so I think that adds a little bit to it.
Rebel Yell, value-wise, this particular batch, I'm probably in the 3.5 range, but I know there's some other, barrels. This particular barrel, I'm probably at 3.5. But we've had some that I would rank even higher than that compete with the likes of Old Rip Van Winkle, I think, on quality. So Rebel Yell is certainly a really good value single barrel wheated bourbon. I'm strong 3.5, maybe even 4 on value on it.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's becoming harder and harder to come by now with an age-stated one at 10 years, 2, and then at 100 proof, and it's a single barrel product. And the wheated bourbon thing, fair or not, has taken on its own kind of reputation thanks a lot to the whole Van Winkle craze. And so you add that in there, and yet, despite all that, to be able to grab it for $59.99 at retail is terrific. So I would be okay with giving it a 4.
All right, question for you. Rebel Yell, single barrel, 100 proof, 10-year. Why wouldn't they call this a bottled in bond?
I thought about that a little bit, and I was trying to think of a product that's bottled in bond that is put out by a company other than the distillery. And I can't think of one.
I can't think of one either. I do know that I've seen on some bottled and bond products, and I don't remember if Old Fitz is one of them, but they will talk about that they are distilled at, this talks about it was distilled at DSPKY 1 and bottled at DSPKY 31. So there are provisions in the code to allow them to be bottled at a place other than where they were distilled, but they have to fully disclose. I'm looking at the back of the Rebel Yell bottle, and it says on their distilled and aged by Rebel Yell Distillery, Louisville, Kentucky, for Lusco and St. Louis. So I'm wondering if it's not that they couldn't, it's that they would have to provide additional disclosure as to the actual location of the distillery in order to make it bottled in bond.
And I also wondered if it's, so to back up, we've been saying these are both Heaven Hill products. Heaven Hill owns the brand Old Fitzgerald. and so when we're saying Old Fitzgerald and Heaven Hill, they're basically one and the same. They share common ownership. But Rebel Yell, even though it's distilled and aged at Heaven Hill, it's then sold to Luxco, who does the branding for Rebel Yell and then bottles it and sells it. And so I wonder if Rebel Yell can label their products as bottled and bond when they're not the ones who can stand behind that process to say that they made sure that it was aged in a federally bonded warehouse and met all the requirements, because they weren't the ones that did it. And so let's say that Rebel Yell in the future wanted to say, listen, we want to have Heaven Hill age the barrels after the distillation and then ship them to one of our locations, either in St. Louis where they're based out of or elsewhere for additional aging or whatever. They've kind of preserved that ability without having to change any of the labeling. And so that may be a lot of the reason why too.
What I'm certain of is that these barrels are probably right next to each other in the warehouse. They're all bonded warehouses is what I'm kind of led to believe. There's probably no difference in this being 100 proof, 10-year single barrel product and it being bottled and bond. It's just they don't elect to make that labeling issue or can't for one reason or the other. But it's the same thing.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. What else do we have here to cover before you take us off topic?
Yeah, I was trying to think of some kind of an analogy, either with sports or pop culture, where you had like siblings who obviously shared a common ancestry, that you had one that decided to try to go and do his or her own thing, and one sort of stayed the course. That would be like the Old Fitzgerald, stayed in house, stayed with the same brand. The other said, no, I'm going to go and be sold to Luxco and be branded as Rebel Yell. And then they end up kind of in the same place anyway. And I couldn't really think of a more fitting example, really. But it seems like that's kind of what's happened here. Is you've had twins, born on almost the same day, basically. They're about the same age. They start the same place. One tries to go down like this beaten path and is branded as Rebel Yell. The other stays in house and is trying to do everything the right way. They think the more traditional route, and they both just kind of end up at the same place. And we're like, yeah, they're sort of the same thing. We just come right back. So
and probably perfect name for Rebel Yell in that analogy as well.
Yeah, someone that was really like, yeah, I'm going to be all rebellious, and then realized, no, I'm basically the same. I cost half as much.
All right. Well, I think that concludes everything. Thank you for joining us, and read the full review over at flightclubict.com.
All right. Thanks.